Thanks. For this month, I chose a topic that I'm not really as well versed in, so I'm certainly hoping to learn something here tonight. But the first paper was by Mary Jane Young, the interrelationship of rock art and astronomical practice in the American Southwest from archaeoastronomy back in 1986, and the SCAAS paper from Alan Munoz, Theoretical and Methodological Approach in Archaeoastronomical Study of the Rock Art of Peñón del Diablo site in Chihuahua, Mexico. Chosen so, we could talk a little bit about methodology in rock art studies and best practices. And I thought the paper, the Young paper, certainly set off a lot of really good groundwork, that could be used. I have some points highlighted. I don't know if anybody else wants to jump in. Feel free to. That would be great. So, I'll just look, talk about some of the things that I thought were really good. With her testing, the bringing up the testing of accidental alignments for light and shadow and situating rock art in the appropriate context kind of reminded me of some of the stuff that was done Fajada Butte by I just drew a blank. What's that?
You're saying that Fajada Butte's from the Sofar's work?
No. In response to that,
okay.
The noontime shadow. Well, what was that paper, Kim? It wasn't Zadi.
Well, there was a series of papers that were very critical of her work, and one of them I remember was by John Carlson's Moonshine on Fajada Butte.
Yeah, the one I was thinking of was less brutal than John Carlson's. The one where he proved that the light and shadow interactions were just as easily by chance. That's the author. I should really know that.
But that's I can jump in there. I think one of the issues that at the very beginning that Anna Sofer was criticized for, she felt that the three slabs had been put in place and had been organized by, as she described them, early young Anasazi Einsteins in terms of this very, very complicated light and shadow effects that the three slabs produce. Turns out I've done field work around the base of Fajada Butte, and there's 5 or 10 other places where there are 3 vertical slabs that have just fallen into place. I think one of the criticisms that she has received, which was legitimate, was that it wasn't organized by the ancestral pueblos, wasn't organized by Chacoan elites, but they used a natural rock fall, and as someone pointed out, it works not at dawn, which is when most of the ritual solar activity was taking place, but at 11:15 in the afternoon, or 11:15 in the morning, and it seemed to me that that combined with there's some 20 rooms on the upper ledges of Fajada Butte that were probably refugios for people living in the canyon in Pueblo 3 times, namely 1180, 1190 onwards, when things were getting very dangerous and springs were drying up. And it was a very dangerous time for everybody. And it seems like those rooms were probably refuges for women and children and maybe men who recognize the danger of some people coming into the canyon and threatening them. So that combined with the likelihood it was a natural rockfall suggests that people were up there in the 1200s, living for several days because there was corn cobs and hearths indicating that they were stayed there for some time, who just found these rocks and happened to be there at 11 in the morning and noticed this light and shadow effect occurring. They were informed that it was close to June solstice, and so they probably marked the wall with charcoal and drew a spiral around where the light was coming in, which is very easy and very natural. And again, for people who were living up there for some time, it was very easy and appropriate for them to do.
Now, Sofer in her paper, and it's referenced here on the supplemental page 51, where Young says, in this respect, the creation of petroglyphs here serve as sort of a yearly solar calendar, which I'll come back to, but in light of last week's discussion, Sofer actually at this site published to what she thought were light and shadow effects for the equinox. Coming out of last month's discussion on the ethnographic lack of ethnographic record for any kind of equinox recognition, what are your thoughts there on her theory of the equinox markings? Is that a happy accident?
Well, there's the main spiral, which apparently really does mark June solstice, and then off to the upper left there's a tiny spiral, and that is the spiral that marks presumably equinox, but there's no evidence that's a unique marking. I mean, around the days near equinox, a beam of light goes through that spiral, but it's not a unique event at all, as far as I can tell. And the other thing that people are now sort of agreeing on is that it's probably not a calendrical device, but a shrine, something to tie human beings to what goes on in the heavens. But it's too small to be a calendrical device. It's almost a little jewel box inside this enclosure, and it's not the kind of thing that you use for a calendar.
Right. That was my next point. I think you were maybe the first to suggest that it was a sun shrine as opposed to a solar calendar, and it's probably a much more accurate way to describe these things.
Well, the sun shrine sort of makes sense if it was built by people who were terrified for their lives, living briefly on top of Hada Butte to connect with an expression of their desire to connect with the sun, the Father's Son, and be protected by him. So a shrine makes sense, and a calendar doesn't make sense.
Can I just ask something? I thought I read someplace, and I don't remember where, is that there was some notion it's a combination. It's a natural fall, but that fall had been worked. Things had been shifted or something like that. Do I remember that correctly? Is that
I think
part of what she said?
That the stones had been rounded, perhaps.
Yeah, or chipped at some angle, or kind of edges to clean an edge or something. So.
And moved slightly, but
Yep.
I think I was one who suggested to her that there are archaeological techniques to look at the shape of crystals that are ground. You can see ground crystals easily in a rock, and if it was moved or if it was shaped, then there would be evidence of that at the site, but that's never been tested.
And actually, did not you and Dr. Monroe find that the peak of Fajada Butte was actually more likely used as a foresight in a horizon sun horizon, sun and horizon interaction?
Well, there is a December solstice sunrise that occurs over Fajada Butte as viewed by an unexcavated Great Kiva in a place called Marcia's Rincon. And we looked into that about 10 years ago from the maps and made a prediction that turned out to work. Namely, the center of this Great Kiva is exactly at the location where the sun comes up over the top of Fajada Butte. And then on that side of Fajada Butte, namely the southwest side, there is a series of ramps and scaffolding that was built to enable people to ascend to the top much more easily than one can do it now. And there were two large fire pits, one at the base of this ramp and one at the top. So one can, if I were in charge of rituals, that would have been a fine ritual. Namely, when the sun comes up at December solstice, to light fires at the bottom and at the top of Fajada Butte. That was very early. That was before the great house culture. It was probably 950 at Marcia's Rincon. So it was one of the earliest astronomical alignments that we know of in Chaco.
Yeah, I think that would certainly even add weight to the argument that it was probably more used as a shrine or a sacred spot than a calendar. Her paper, Young's paper also goes on to talk about some of the other claims made at that site, such as the 18.6 lunar cycle, and the eclipses, and the precise moment of noon, which I'm still struggling with that paper. The author was ran the Center for Archaeoastronomy with Carlson. It was
John Carlson. Yeah.
No, with Carlson. He did work with the Hopi before he moved to cathedrals.
McCluskey.
McCluskey, thank you. Oh my gosh, that was killing me. Yeah, right. McCluskey did that noontime shadow retort to an additional paper that came out from Sofair at Fajada Butte. And then Young's paper goes on to talk about Holly House, which would have been nice to have Ray here to discuss.
Yeah, I forgot that he sort of spent some time with that. So.
And one thing, one note here, that I wanted to talk about too is, that she mentions, however, that there's no ethnographic evidence to indicate some of these practices were carried out there, such as the sighting of specific petroglyphs, that they were used as sighting devices. Discussing some of these other works done by Robert and Ann Preston. I was wondering if anybody had opinions on that. What I'm looking at is actually page 52 of Young's paper, where she talks about two other types of sites, the Fajada Butte site and sites where specific petroglyphs may function as sighting devices. Is that a thing that anybody has opinions on? I mean, I haven't seen any kind of statistical analysis applied to applied to that kind of thinking, since there's certainly no ethnographic support for it.
Well, it's interesting that she sort of contradicts herself by talking about sites that were not calendrical sites, but sites that a sun watcher would visit. That there are a number of places that they would make a ritual circuit, and these sites would be marked by concentric circles or spirals or something like that. So these were places for a sun watcher to walk to, and presumably look at the sun. But so there seems to be some ethnographic evidence for petroglyphs marking a place for a sun priest to visit on a ritual walk.
Oh, I would agree. In spring, I actually went and I did some resurvey of some published work by Todd Bostwick at a HOCOM site at Shaw Butte in Arizona. And from his published data, I remeasured it, and then I showed up the morning of the spring equinox, and the petroglyphs did align very much, just like he said. I came home with my own confirmation photographs, but the question is, what does that mean? I mean, coming out of our conversation last month, these were published as petroglyphs that point to the equinox sunrise, which I'm skeptical of. They obviously did. I showed up and I saw they did, but what does that mean really? What did that mean to the ancient Hohokam? Was that to the cardinal directions? Because I'd have to check my notes, but I don't think my readings were exactly on 90 degrees either. So it does raise questions.
Well, Jane Young is a very, very careful and very thorough archaeologist and archaeoastronomer, or ethnoastronomer, she describes herself as. And following the paper that we read, she's published this book. It's called Signs from the Ancestors, which is large and extensive, but really discusses many of these things that we're considering right now in great detail. So I'd suggest, if anyone wants to read more of Jane Young's work, it's very useful. She's really interested in the culture and using Zuni cosmological ideas to try to interpret rock art. And I think she comes away with a great deal of humility, saying it's very hard.
She also is very fair. I think she explains herself very well. She doesn't, she obviously doesn't, she's working towards not making any commitments.
That's right.
Be pushing forward the idea of how difficult it is to trace back the cultural context beyond our reach. But I was going to ask about more of the middle part of the paper instead of the sun shadow events, but I might be the only person in the world that I have a problem with the representation of the moon as a rainbow arc, and I noticed it happens in this paper on page 46. There's that one, the Zia, Great Kivas of Zuni area, and then is the petroglyph that is actually at Chaco Canyon. That sort of the famous moon and star kind of thing. Anyway, the moon doesn't necessarily do that. If it's oriented, if there's an implied horizon, the moon doesn't arc that direction, and that's sort of it's always bothered me about that thing. I don't know if anybody else has talked about that, or if that's in written record, or
that's interesting.
So I would I've been racking my brain over the years after sort of seeing the one in Chaco to say, well, okay, what phenomena does do that? And a total lunar eclipse will, when it's not total. So you can have a definite arc of moonlight with most of the moon in shadow. It will create essentially something like a crescent moon, but it doesn't have to follow the rules of the crescent pointing towards the sun. And so it theoretically can happen, but it just surprised me when I sort of opened this paper and saw the depiction on page 46 is very, very similar to the one in Chaco Canyon.
Right. That's Penasco Blanco, Kim, correct? The one that was
yeah, I think it's
well, the one she has in her paper is from the village of the Great Kivas.
right.
Right,
And
but
it has an owl, and has a path of the owl, and has a moon and a star. It's suggested as being one of the 1054 supernova events.
Right.
But I think in her book anyhow, she discusses that particular petroglyph in more detail and really says it's open to many different interpretations, and the Zunis themselves have given a more cultural interpretation.
I saw the way she wrote that. That was really kind of clever. Right.
right. Yeah,
And it's interesting. She has encountered on a number of instances asking Zunis about what's the meaning of these petroglyphs, and some of them will say, "Oh, that's a supernova," and she asked them, "Why did you come up with that idea?" And well, an astronomer once told me. So it's pretty hard to get the pre-elite Western interpretation to get before that. You know?
right. She calls that cultural feedback.
Yeah.
So I thought. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
I think Anthony Abini talked at the American Astronomical Society meeting in like 2016, and he pretty much, his whole speech was there are no representations of supernovas in rock art in the American Southwest anywhere, period. I mean, he just pretty much, because most of these things you're talking about the direction of the crescent and that kind of stuff, most of these don't. I think one of the basic requirements for a interpretation like that is that the position of the crescent and the position of the supernova have to be generally related to the way it would have been at that moment in the sky. And most of these point in all different directions, or they're inverted, where the moon or the supernova is on the wrong side of the moon, et cetera, et cetera. It's one thing you can go into a stellarium and they have a historical supernova program you can connect onto, and you can actually go in and do a study on the supernovas and their positions and the time of day, et cetera. Because some of the supernovas weren't very visible for very long, especially at night. And so some of them, if you look at the light curve on a supernova, some of them die off real quick. So the chance of a supernova being recorded is pretty small, let's say, and getting it correct as far as how the celestial objects actually appear in the sky in relation to each other and transpose it to a rock art panel. So it's very difficult. So.
Yeah, that's a great point. I think Young might herself say in this paper that culturally they would be more concerned with objects or phenomena that displayed regularity as opposed to something different. At least the Egyptian. Somebody.
Well, there's a very important paper in the Journal of Skyscape Archaeology, Volume 1, by Ed Krupp, where he goes through every single one of the strong suggestions for 1054 petroglyph and analyzes them very carefully and concludes that none of them really meet his test. I think that's probably what Tony Vini was referring to.
I think Kim, I think I misspoken. I think it was Krupp that actually spoke. That's right.
Hey, Evelyn, I think feedback off. Yeah.
There we go.
And Jason has his hand up. Did you want to add?
Yeah, I just wanted to, I guess I have a question about the supernova thing. And excuse me, I'm experiencing my own solar alignment here as we speak. I have always been curious as to where they get, where it's come to that conclusion. You know, I heard a couple of references, particularly the Crab Nebula, right? The supernova that caused what's now the Crab Nebula.
That's the big one, 1054. Yes,
that's the one we're talking about. Okay,
yeah.
So yeah, I have heard these references, and my curiosity has always been like, where did we get to that conclusion? Can we speak to or address that? Like, where did these researchers where did they get where they got to? That's my question.
Well, I think that the first basic question on that is that most of these supernovas since Common Era were actually visible during the daytime. So at least for a short period. So not only were they a new star, obviously nova, being a new star in the celestial sphere that they would have noticed. Typically it was so bright that it was also visible for some period of time during the day. So I think that's why those events may have been recorded.
Sure.
And so, does that answer your question?
No, I'm getting why do these, very simply, why do these researchers think that those particular rock art representations are depicting the supernova? It seems very much of it's always seemed quite a stretch to me anyway.
Well, that would have been great if Ray would have joined us tonight. I think he was a co-author on one of the first papers that discussed that.
I think the argument is that 1054 was a time when the Anasazi or the Chaco great houses culture was at its peak, and they were living in Chaco Canyon. The atmosphere was very clear, of course, and so it was a brilliant event. It was visible during the daytime for 3 weeks, and for something like that to appear out of nowhere would have been very very shocking, very puzzling, and so people have felt that maybe they left some record of that. And perhaps these were pictographs or petroglyphs that show a rock, show a star, and a crescent moon. And when the supernova first appeared in July of 1054, there was a waning crescent moon visible. So a combination of a crescent moon plus a star in Chaco Canyon left the possibility open that these were marks of the supernova. And I suppose there's a non-zero possibility that really was an explanation for it, but it really hasn't stood the test of time.
So then the other question, obviously an event worthy of documenting, certainly, and then the questioning or the skepticism of it being less than an accurate or not a specifically accurate depiction with the orientation of the crescent moon and whatnot. Is there any, well, obviously the lineage and the of traditional knowledge is hard to assess and hard to come by in that way. But the idea of not maybe people not being as concerned with the meticulous accuracy of depicting it as like a photograph or whatnot, but just representing it as just documenting it as an event, making note of it, kind of thing. I don't know. Just a thought.
Yeah,
comment.
I think that's right. And I think Young comments about how we shouldn't demand precision from these people. They were representing something that they felt was pretty sacred, and precision is sort of what astronomers now are concerned with, but that culture was not. So that if they saw something in the sky and the moon, I think any kind of depiction combining the two could have been a representation of it. But again, Florence Hawley Ellis, I think Jane Young talks about her, preeminent archaeologist, pointed out that you see on pictographs and petroglyphs throughout the Southwest combinations of stars and moons and hands. So there's nothing fundamentally unique about that combination.
Yeah, well, that almost happens monthly, with a crescent of some kind and Venus.
Evelyn, I think you had a question.
Well, not so much a question as a comment. Well, when I think it was the Hopi who say that it's a sun watching station, and maybe you mentioned that earlier since I came on late, but I think that's a much more logical explanation for that particular combination of petroglyphs or pictographs, either one. And I know Ed Krupp and I have tried to visit all of the so-called 12 of them, and have written a paper or two, and you may have mentioned that also, that had other explanations. Usually when they were saying that, they cropped the image so that it was just what they wanted to see, not the whole panel. And when we're documenting rock art, we want to see the whole picture, and sometimes there are stories that are totally unrelated. Or if you get the ethnography from the local people, it may be that they're, especially as already mentioned, more likely lunar, because they do a lot of their ceremonies based on that, or also the combination with Venus, that's really important. And well, sometimes I was occasionally asked, oh, was this other symbol there? And it was a particular clan symbol that they were looking for. And so there's a different level of knowledge and interaction with those designs that astronomers aren't really looking for. And so I think some of their conclusions are, they thought they were right, as was pointed out. I mean, it was an obvious big event. However, to a native person, it may have been a scary event, and it may not have been something you would want to put in. I know I've had Navajo helpers here, and they actually asked to go home, and they wanted to be in shelter when the eclipse came, and they didn't want to see it, and they would not have wanted to depict that. So we have a lot to learn from our native people about, they certainly were watching the stars, they had constellations, they had ceremonies related a lot of times to when maybe the Pleiades appeared or other timings that other than a supernova.
So an interesting caveat is the beneath the star and the hand and the crescent moon there is a pictograph of something that looks like Halley's Comet. If you've ever been there, it's a better depiction of Halley's Comet than many other artists have done at that period of time. And it shows some concentric circles and flames going along behind it. And unlike the star and the moon and the hand, it is a unique pictograph. There's no other pictograph similar to that in the canyon, certainly. And of course, in 1066, at the time of the Battle of Hastings, was one of the very bright apparitions of Halley's Comet visible in the canyon. So there is it complicates the whole story. There is a possibility that they put a depiction of Halley's Comet up there next to a depiction of the supernova. It's a possibility. You know?
I was just going to say that to Evelyn's point, where you're exactly right, where you frame it. They always talk about the 1054, but underneath it's that comet petroglyph. So it's a much bigger story.
Yeah.
Although, why is the crescent the wrong position with respect to the star? It's been my impression that most of the Native American pictographs they're intending to show something. They know what they would have been doing. So I'm surprised to see that there, that it was wrong from that vantage point. And in fact, I guess the skyline is such that it wouldn't have been visible from that point. They would have had to have been in another position to actually see it. So it seems to me there's a lot of problems with that.
Well, no, they would have seen it below Peñasco Blanco. The eastern horizon is visible. And besides that, for some reason they built scaffolding. You know, the pictograph is up maybe 20 feet above the ground. So it looks as though for some reason they wanted to get a good view of what was going on the horizon. They could have seen it from below, but to build a scaffolding to get them up that high means that something was going on that's unusual.
Evelyn, just as a point of order, we are getting an echo from your computer after you stop talking. So I've been muting you. If it looks like you're getting muted accidentally, it's because I've been kind of cutting it. So you maybe turn on your mic to talk and then turn off again.
Okay. I was just saying it would appear to me that they could have been viewing it from the pueblo up above. So I don't know. I'm just trying to play the devil's advocate here.
And Evelyn, I'm going to go back to some comment I made earlier when before you got here. Is I think it's more important that the moon is actually in an impossible position. It's not. I think it's meaningful that if it's backwards for the star, that's something. But the moon doesn't take on the shape where the points are down. That doesn't necessarily happen. So there's that's actually, for me, actually a more important anomaly than whether they represented it in a relationship between the moon and the star correctly.
So I have a couple other thoughts regarding just rock art in general. One of them being a recognition of many of these sites are actually sites where people would go to experience a vision or some kind of ordeal, a spiritual ordeal, and express that vision there in that way on those rocks. And also, we know that there was a lot of sharing of ideas, right? Knowledge, trade includes more than just material goods, right? We're trading and spreading of knowledge and ideas and documentation of observational knowledge for a long duration and a long ancestral bed of knowledge to other parts of the region, very, very far south, very, very far north. Has anybody presented the idea of this documentation as a the depiction here as a possible documentation of it, how it appeared somewhere else.
Oh, interesting.
Or maybe it's just a vision.
Or that's a good idea. Or representation of something that's secondhand knowledge. Someone told them about it, and they, they heard there was a moon and a bright star, and they just put it on the wall. That's true.
Right. This is part of our, part of the migration story. Part of this tradition. This is where this knowledge comes from, and this is how we're going to mark and denote it here.
And this in particular would have had a sacred dimension to it.
Yes.
Certainly, if anything was a hierophany, namely appearance of the sacred, that would have been seen as this brilliant object coming out of nowhere.
Marking and denoting that time and space.
Mm-hmm.
Place.
So it makes sense that people were looking for some evidence of that, but I'm not sure we found it.
Something you said earlier, Kim, about just the test of time too. That's just kind of interesting to me that, an idea can flourish for a little while. And then if 10 years later, it's no further than it was 10 years ago, then does that mean we move past it? It's not a winner. It's not going to happen.
Well, that's happening in Chaco Canyon now. If you've been there, there's still a big sign that says supernova pictograph, regardless of whether the majority of archaeologists or astronomers believe it really was. But I think it's good for public, to entertain the public.
I'd like to jump in these last couple of minutes and take the things that Young laid out as solid methodology in approaching this, and get everybody's opinion on how you think that played out in the Munoz paper, and some when he talks about his methodology, a lot of it he's on the same track as Young, but what are your thoughts on how successful he was with it?
Well, he mentioned that he used a compass, and he briefly mentioned the use of stellarium, but he really didn't flesh out the whole methodology in his paper of exactly how he went about establishing some of this. And I think that's the problem we have in archaeoastronomy as a agreed upon methodology in some of these sites. And I know that Young, really suggested that we need to have a rigorous methodology. And I think that the use of theodolites or total stations or I think my personal opinion is that every site that has rock art that is suspected to be astronomical interactions should have an investigation of the horizon astronomy or some other detail as to how that culture or that group of people understood when the solstice or the equinox, or shall I use the word cross-quarter day? I know that's a flashpoint word, but how did they establish that? And there isn't an agreement amongst us as to what is the best methodology.
I think those are good points. I think he says he uses landscape archaeology in his approach, but he doesn't really describe how he uses it.
There was.
Well, he identifies two things that Jane Young told us to be very cautious about, namely a spiral and concentric circles. And his methodology for this particular paper was to look for every rock art that had concentric circles and to see if it had any astronomy in it. And that's sort of going backwards. He should have read Jane Young before coming up with his technology.
I think the thing that struck me most is his figure 3, where he shows the panel of the rock art and the alignments to the summer solstice and the winter solstice. He has a scale at the bottom that's 1 meter, but his quincunx petroglyph at the bottom seems to be entirely too small to pose any kind of alignment to any kind of horizon image. If his scale is 1 meter there, the entire portion of that rock art panel that he's using to draw an alignment or draw his lines is 1/3 of a meter at best. And
I printed up that diagram, figure 3, to see if I could make any more sense of it. But the center of those two lines going off to the solstices is two concentric circles, and then he has just drawn 2 lines, one to summer solstice and one to winter solstice. There's no justification for those particular alignments that he's drawn in there. So it's a certain amount of wishful thinking.
I was going to go back to a comment just Kim, you said about looking at every concentric circle and then sort of like trying to draw the association. That is a way to build a statistical kind of analysis, right? If you know every concentric circle in a region and then you can compare them, that's actually, there's something statistical about that you can derive, as opposed to just all kinds of mishmash of different rock art that has different kinds of objects and things like that. So I think
right.
one of the things I think that rigor brings is the power of statistics. I mean, once you have samples that are hundreds and of sites and things like that, then you can actually start to use statistics. If you have 3 sites, then it doesn't work at all. So anyway, so there is something in the idea of a careful documentation of a whole, like all of this or all of that, and there's something to that.
That's right. That certainly could be done. Certainly could be done in Chaco, to look at every single spiral. There's a lot of spirals in the canyon, and there's very few of them that are associated with astronomy. And there's all sorts of concentric circles. So one could easily use documentation records that have been made of rock art in Chaco and do the kind of statistics that you're suggesting. And it would be interesting. But I think the result we could predict is that a fairly small fraction are associated with astronomy.
Right. Well, I think the big question is the pre-selection of the circle in the first place.
Yeah.
The concentric circle. So I think to Rick's point, if you did you had a null hypothesis, you do a random sampling of petroglyphs and then do the statistics. And if something comes out where you're consistently getting alignments, then that would be something.
Yeah, that's a great point. I don't know if I would be hard pressed to believe that nobody's done statistical analysis on that.
Well, I would ask Evelyn. Huh? I'll even unmute you if you want. But, I mean, you've looked at more rock art more scientifically than almost anybody, certainly. So do you go to the part where you sort of derive statistical analysis of a certain object or a certain?
We've done it a bit. We have more data than we have analysis. And at Sears Point, for instance, there were over 8,000 individual elements, and one of the largest categories were circles. And I don't recall now exactly where concentric circles fit in with that. We certainly had a lot. And when I gave the talk on the data from that at the Albuquerque meeting, and I showed a particular panel that had a lot of concentric circles, actually. But there I was intrigued by the light and shadow of what looked like a profile face and how it was interacting there. And I asked for people to study this. I've actually tried to get grad students to use my data and haven't had success yet with anybody picking it up and using it. We also have a large data set from Canyon de Chelly. And well, actually Canyon del Muerto, 150 sites in there. And so there's a lot of data. I wish I could say that there had been more analysis, but sorry.
That's true. With Chaco, Jane Colbert had a five-year project documenting every single rock art in Chaco, supported by the park, and it's all stored away in University of New Mexico in Albuquerque. But you know, that's a good job for a graduate student. Although graduate students probably want something more exciting than that.
It's a retirement project for somebody. Evelyn, can I ask you another question then? So, and this kind of came up before. I think I can't remember. I think Gordon mentioned this. Is rock art appears in all kinds of conditions, and like one of the ones I used to go to Circle Z, I think that's I-17. It's in a I mean, it's very much in a ravine. There is no real horizon. Everything is sort of like, and so I've seen rock art as it appears on a cliff face where it faces just an immense landscape. We've seen rock art where it appears in tight little sites where you have no view of the sky. Has anybody done any kind of analysis sort of about the type of characters or the type of markings that might be in one or the others of those?
There certainly has been landscape analysis done, but I don't know specifically related to astronomy. And that could be done because then, at least in our Sears Point data, we categorized each particular panel, whether it was on a boulder, on a cliff face, or along a trail. So you could pull out that type of data. And we did do some analysis with that. And it turns out the only one that was had significance was the placement of cupule rocks. And they were significantly placed on the tops of mesa, and that was on horizontal surfaces. But every time I was up on top of those mesas, I was drawn to the fact that the landscape that you could view from up there was so incredible that, and also, you know, we had ethnography that said that only certain initiated people could go on the tops. The uninitiated had to go along the bottoms of the cliffs, and the women had to go along the bottom, in part because they were collecting the mesquite and they were processing it, and that's where that was. So there was reason to believe that there was ceremonial reasons for the cupules, and I don't know, though I could not detect. I did try to look at if I could, you know, see an obvious Orion belt or Big Dipper or something. And no, but that doesn't mean that they weren't used as part of some sort of initiation or ceremony, or at least direction finding for sacred mountains. that you could see from there. I don't know if that truly answered your question, but
No, it does. And the fact that you did take the time to keep track of those categories of where a rock art shows or exposes itself. I think that's part of that data collection that I think needs to happen.
and we have two actually published papers on astronomy there. Tom Hoskinson, who's passed away, he was an astronomer from California, had an alignment with solstices, and that was two cairns up on top with a path in between. And in fact, when we were discussing that earlier, I thought about the fact that in the paper with that boulder that he just drew two lines. Well, actually, looking at the center of that boulder, and it has a depression there. At a lot of the sites that I've seen that have been documented, you would be looking out in between that valley to see where the what arose there. So that was, I don't know if he tried or thought about doing that, but the other ethnography that we have, and I haven't read this paper in a long time, was along a cliff face. And it was fascinating. I think it was the Quechan people. Again, that's their traditional territory. It was a complex and wonderful. The imagery, the stories associated with it, the meaning in their stories of their creation, and the timing of things. And it was light and shadow. And some of those were dot patterns, and one was two climbing, vertical climbing bighorn sheep. And it's interesting, a lot of the times I would see these bighorn sheep seem to be at sites that I wondered if maybe there had been a constellation that they were, was part of their tradition. But if we've lost, that data, by the way, was collected by Boma Johnson, and he's passed. So all these, the knowledge from the elders are gone, and I don't know that we'd be able to even get that information now if it wasn't passed on to the younger generation and the people that have the connection to it.
Yeah.
Sorry to be negative, but
No, I agree. I think it's
Well, we're at the top of the hour. Does anybody else have any other points they'd like to make? Mark, I saw you got a shout out in this paper. You have anything you might want to add?
No.
I think the theme for both of them was, we need a stronger methodology and be aware of biases. That's kind of what I took from this.
I agree. It's a difficult subject, and I applaud the people who have been working this area for a long period of time, and especially Evelyn. Thanks for joining us. I appreciate having you here, especially with the subject matter, because I said it before. I think it again. You probably looked at more rock art than most people. Yeah.
You're muted, Evelyn. Sorry.
Yeah, I had to do that again.
I was agreeing as far as amount of rock art and saying not just here in the Southwest, but around the world.
Yeah.
And astronomy plays a big role in other cultures also. So it's especially like in the navigation in the South Pacific, and we visited Australia 7 times and many places, New Guinea and New Caledonia and New Zealand. And there's lots of cupules, and there's lots of what we would just call scratched imagery. but they were lines, or they have string games, and they were navigating by these. And it's, if you, well, I'm sure if you've read any of those books, it's just totally fascinating. And the navigational system of the Pacific Islanders. So, yes, and I think we've lost a lot. So, well, as I mentioned, elders have gone. I had a friend in Australia who was just in tears because the Aboriginal elder would not pass on the information to a white person. It had to be to an initiated younger person, and none of the initiates or none of the young people wanted to be initiated. So that information is gone.
Here it is.
So,
A dead end.
sorry, again, why I'm being so negative. Normally I'm just a positive, yay, go.
Well, Evelyn, how about this? I don't know. You've documented a whole bunch and all that stuff, but have you thought of writing a book about yourself and your travels? And that should be something you tackle, because otherwise, I think it's fascinating that you took the time to go to Australia 7 times. I mean,
Well, it's not so much fascinating when you know that my sister, one of my 2 sisters, lives there. So I have a good excuse. I go visit for 3 days, and then I spend about a month traveling around looking at the rock art after that.
it's great.
And no, I can't imagine writing a book about me. Sorry.
No, somebody else. Maybe your husband.
No, I know it's kind of a different category of rock art, but those are the big stone spheres up in South America and other parts of the Pacific. Correct me if I'm wrong, but as far as I understand, it's pretty widely accepted now that those are navigational markers. Is that right? No?
You have to unmute again. Sorry, Evelyn.
We don't know. You know what I'm talking about, right? You're familiar with that.
Familiar with them in Costa Rica. We just saw them in 2020, and they're just amazing. But I had not seen that. Well, in fact, the stuff I was reading is they didn't know. They didn't know. And they were. Does
anybody else have any insight on that? I'm gonna go find some references. I'll get back to you.
I don't think we know their original time. So we don't know a lot of them were. So I don't know if we can really speculate on how they may have been used. They're fascinating to think how they might have been used, but without knowing exactly where they were before they were removed. I don't know if we'll be able to solve that one either.
Well, thank you again all for coming. I think this has been really good. Our next meeting, Chris said, is going to be on, I wrote it down, the 21st of September. And we will work to get the articles up on the webpage and get them out sooner, so we can, have a little bit more time to read them. And we're going to strive to get kind of a working list going, so we're not, just doing this always just before. And we also need, right now we're relying on Chris. So if you have any thoughts or any papers you want to recommend, you can send them to me or Chris. That would be really helpful.
So there's no secret like teaser about what we might be talking about in a month, or still be determined?
I have a couple ideas. One of the things that I'd like to bring up, it's a little more lengthy, but a conversation between Kim and Lionel Sims and others that went back and forth in the pages of Skyscape Archaeology Journal on minor lunar standstills back in, Kim, was that 2016?
It's been going on for a number of years. Yes, right.
But I meant particularly Lionel's forum.
Yes, yeah, we've been battling it out for some time. Unfortunately, Lionel is dying of cancer, and we're putting together a fest script for him, in which I have a paper, in which I've been very careful not to be argumentative. So I don't feel right now I have the energy to debate Lionel.
Yeah, understandable.
Fair.
But regardless, that is a great forum there that Kim and Fabio put together for that topic, and that's all free access. If anybody's interested in looking at it ahead of that.
And so, like I said, please check out the webpage. What I'm trying to get working out is maybe get some forum ability there, so we can post these ideas. We can follow up on some of these comments that we have, papers that we mentioned. You know, the discussion doesn't have to stop here, and that'd be a great place to, you know, stimulate some ideas about next papers and which direction we want to go. So I think the real power of this would be is the ideas that we've explored tonight. If we could just follow up on those, but that, you know, it takes time and effort. So just bear with us while we slowly get this together, and hopefully, you know, grow into something nice.
How about looking or trying to get some native input here? And I know some good books on Navajo constellations, for instance. And Bondell, of course, has written a whole book, I think, on that, if I'm remembering right. Because I think, well, especially from my point of view, I know we've seen like rabbit tracks as in rock art, and the depiction as it's shown in To the Navajo, and that's even found out at Chaco. Not even, I mean, that was, I think, one of the ones he described. But anyway, just a thought from my point of view, I would enjoy hearing some native perspectives, or at least studies literature.
Sorry, I didn't mean to talk over you. But yeah, there's a few references. I think Nancy Maryboy, she wrote the book on, yeah. Does anybody have any?
Yeah, Nancy Maryboy and David Begay wrote a book on
Right.
Navajo constellations.
They've been guests. So I do a broadcast every other Wednesday, and they've been guests on that. We've had her on a couple of times. So they're available, and they do like to talk about the stuff. They also have a NASA grant, and so they also have so they're kind of obligated to talk about some things that are sort of part of that, and the dissemination of information. And sort of anyway, it might be a thought. If this journal club, though, is really paper driven as opposed to I think is where we started this. So I suppose an excerpt out of a book probably is fair game, but I think it probably has to be in literature, I think, for us to do it. And that's not a hard and fast rule, but that's my own opinion.
So yeah, there are indigenous scholars. I know. So at least in the field house, how far along that is, I guess maybe we could try to find some articles, scholarly work by indigenous researchers.
Yeah, and it's an excellent suggestion, Jason.
I'll try to look for some.
Is anybody else curious whose Ron's iPhone is? I don't know. Maybe we can have him reveal himself or herself. not.
Nope.
We, some of us, I'll just sort of mention this, it's an aside because I think many of you have been to these conferences, but several of us, board members, went to the PECOS conference a week or so ago in Mancos, Colorado. And if you don't know the conference, it's archaeology based and it's annual. It's in a wilderness setting. It's historic. It actually was, the conference was started in 1927 in Pecos, New Mexico, and we were able to have a table there to kind of talk about ourselves and sort of solicit some membership. We offered free memberships to students and free memberships to persons of affiliated Native American tribes. And we've got some interest. And one of the things I was talking about kind of relates to some comments I heard on this, and I appreciate Ruth's paper because of it, is that idea of rigor and documentation. And so what we're really, it's a new initiative of the organization to try to come up with sort of just some documentation sets, just some things that every site should look at, just a checklist. You know, does it this, does it that, does it that, related to horizons or related to this, you know, all those other things. And it leads, hopefully leads to getting to the point where we really do have a rigorous enough database with a whole bunch of little checkpoints that then we can use the power of statistics to derive some ideas. And so it's probably, it's late in coming. We've been doing archaeology for over 100 years, and I'm not sure anybody has done this on a real rigorous scale. But you know, it's a new effort of ours, and we're going to try to do that. So if anybody else has any comments about that, and I know it's a little aside from our conversation, but everybody seems to be hanging around.
Well, I have a question for Evelyn. Sorry, but Rick,
No, that's good.
but you've been around the world and you've seen quite a bit of rock art, and the predominant numbers of solar markers or light and shadow interactions seem to be in the American Southwest. I've come across some indications in Brazil and in France, but in all of your travels, have you had indications that there are solar interactions recording astronomical knowledge in all around the world?
I'm trying to remember. I do not recall knowing anything from the native people, but I have certainly seen at many sites what I would call standing stones. And they might just be in a boulder field, but they're placed upright. And are they marking trails? Were they looking at shadows? And I even did speak with some Aboriginal young people who were actually the rangers at the park I was at. And they were regretting what I was regretting earlier, that the knowledge was gone from the people that were there. And in fact, they had a big display about the massacre that took place there. It's scary. Many cultures have that. But at any rate, that knowledge was gone. So it would not surprise me that if that was, but we don't know. That was in Western Australia, and that's the one that popped into my mind. And right now, I can't. If I think of something, I could send an email out to people, but
Okay.
sorry.
Yeah.
Too many
Thank you.
places, too many years.
Hey, this is Ron Barber.
Hey, hi, Ron.
Hey, I figured out how to unmute it finally.
We're an hour and 10 minutes into an hour program, so it's good to hear from you. Hi, Ron.
Yeah, I've been watching all along, and
good.
interesting conversations.
Yeah.
So anyway, that's who Ron Barber is. I'm I have a
Okay.
project called the Stone Calendar Project. A lot of you've probably heard some of my presentations. And so anyway, that's who Ron Barber's iPhone 12 is.
I'm glad you joined. This is super. Tell us more about the project, though. Should we? Is this something we can look at?
I don't have anything published online. I don't write any reports. And this has actually been the key to my success in working with several tribes around the Southwest,
Yeah.
private landowners. They've all said they don't want to see any of this published. But I do have approval to use it for education purposes. And so I presented it, to museums and archaeology groups, rock art junkies, as I call them. And I've presented some at the conference too.
Excellent.
Well, I'm gonna have to run, guys. It's great seeing you. Hope to see you next time.
Great. Okay.
Okay.
Yeah, thanks, Chris. Thanks to Chris for
Yeah.
organizing this.
Yeah, thank you, Chris.
Yeah.
Thank you
Appreciate
guys
it.
for making this possible. It's great. And my main goal is to learn something, and I have both sessions. And I thank you, Kim and Evelyn, and everybody.